got ukulele chords. That would be interesting. This Easter has been very different when we compare it to last year. And as I was having a conversation earlier on the phone with someone, I was actually thinking, oh my goodness, it has been very different. Last Easter we spent about 5 or 6 weeks going through the Stations of the Cross, which is not often done in non-Anglican services. It's usually an Anglican or a Catholic church service that the Stations of the Cross is used. But last year we did that. We spent about 6 weeks going through the Stations of the Cross in the lead up to Easter. This year, you probably are aware, Easter has suddenly come upon us in the messages because we haven't even mentioned anything about the lead up to Easter in our services until this week. And in these last few weeks, we've been traveling around the Gospels, but have mainly focused on the Gospel of Mark. And it is to this same book that we return today. Those of you that were here in recent weeks, we've talked about questions that Jesus asks and some of the incredible statements that he makes. So we're going to look again at a question, only this time it won't be coming from Jesus. And we're going to look at the fact that even Mark, the writer, seems to be not connecting with even some of the things that Jesus is saying. It's almost as if he's not listening. So I'm going to read from Mark chapter 15, verses 1 to 15. How about that? Very early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of." But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to get Pilate to release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him!" Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. I'm going to work through the passage a few verses at a time. There's some very poignant things as we come through it. So let's start with the first 2 verses of Mark 15. Very early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. You have said so, replied Jesus. Mark draws our attention to it being very early in the morning. There's no real reason why he seems to do that. But he then goes on to say that the religious authorities were up to something. They were planning something. Because it says in that very first verse that they made their plans. And they carried out that plan by binding Jesus and taking him to Pilate. Then we get the first question. But this is one asked by Pilate. Are you the King of the Jews? And how does Jesus answer? You have said so. I don't know whether you're aware, but there are 3 gospel writers that draw our attention to this comment that Jesus makes. You have said so. Matthew and Luke's version of the same account also say, and I'll refer to them. So Matthew uses it in chapter 26, verse 64, and Luke in chapter 23, verse 3. You have said so, Jesus replied. Exactly the same words in 3 Gospels. It's interesting that all 3 writers, they focus on lots of other things in their accounts, but on that particular phrase, they repeat it word for word. Mark goes on to write, the chief priests accused him of many things. So again Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? Pilate was expecting Jesus to come back at the chief priests' accusations because he asked the question, aren't you going to answer? And then Mark wants his readers to be aware of those many accusations that the chief priests had made. Jesus has not only answered the question, because we know he said, you have said so. But I wonder whether Mark is drawing our attention to Pilate and to Pilate's response. I wonder if it is more to do with Pilate's expectation of Jesus' answer. It certainly was an unusual answer. No defense, no fight back from Jesus. And the way that it's written by Mark, it's almost as if Mark seems a little preoccupied by Pilate's response of, aren't you going to answer? Then Mark wants us to be aware that Pilate is now drawing Jesus' attention to the accusations being made against him. In part 2 of verse 4 and verse 5, Mark writes, see how many things they are accusing you of. But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. It really does read to me as if Pilate was trying to help Jesus out of a fix. Or maybe Pilate at his core was a people pleaser, and he wanted to prove that he had covered all his bases. Pilate seems to be hoping that Jesus says something to help him release Jesus. It's almost as if he's saying it like this: Jesus, surely you can see all the things they are accusing you of. Defend yourself. But Jesus remains silent after his initial answer. He knows what he has to do. He lets God work the circumstances around him so that the purpose for which Jesus came comes about. Mark writes more in verses 6 to 8. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Now, I almost missed something. Thank goodness Kate was there to spot this. Because I was going to ignore the word custom in there. I was getting distracted by something else. But there was a clear reason why this is there. Whose custom? Pilate's? The chief priests? The Roman authorities? Whose custom was it? But we actually know. We actually know. It was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner. And what was the festival that led up to this event? I'm deliberately keeping my face away from John because I know he knows the answer to this. So I'm looking over here. What was the festival that was going on at this time? I'm pretty sure one of you knows this festival. Passover was coming up, definitely. Yep, it was coming up. You could say it's sort of all entangled in the Easter event to some degree. Kate put them out of their misery. It is, but what is it called?
The custom that we are talking about on the approach to Passover is the Paschal sacrifice. And so therefore, as a sort of visual aid or whatever, they release somebody almost like a scapegoat. And so this was part of, you're right, it's part of the Passover. It's just in front of the Passover. It's the idea of releasing a scapegoat that runs off with all the sins and just bringing freedom.
And this event is actually referred to in the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verse 39. So it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews? So when John refers to your custom, or you could say Pilate refers to your custom, he was talking about the custom at Passover that a prisoner be released and pardoned. And as Kate said, known as the Paschal pardon. Pilate appears to want to release Jesus, and therefore he refers to this custom in the hope that the people agree to release Jesus. However, the religious leaders had incited the people against Jesus. Their response to Pilate's request was to choose Barabbas over Jesus. But we also know, because it was always prophesied, that Jesus was going to die. And Jesus knew he was going to die. And so, in one sense, he had to remain silent. In one sense, he had no choice. You could say, perhaps, that this was one of the few passive moments of Jesus' life in the lead up to Easter, what we now know as Easter. So the crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did, release a prisoner as per the custom at Passover. At that time, This would have been bad news for the disciples because they still hadn't got it. They still had not understood that Jesus had to die. They were convinced that he was going to be a warrior king like David. And as yet, he hadn't been. So to the disciples, this was not the good news they were expecting. And if we were living back then, it probably wouldn't have been good news to us either. But as I said, it was good news to Jesus. And of course, we have hindsight and history on our side. The disciples had none of that. So Pilate now says, "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" Knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priest had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to get Pilate to release Barabbas instead. So we're reading that Mark seems to think that the blame, that Pilate is to blame for the unfortunate predicament that he's in. That although he was trying to find a way to wriggle out of it by sort of blaming the chief priests, Pilate, if he really wanted to, he could have found a way. And we know from the verses that it is out of self-interests that the chief priests ask for Barabbas rather than Jesus. They're scared of Jesus, terrified. They've seen him do stuff that really shook their world. So we know that Barabbas, for the internet, I just got my nerds mixed up. That Barabbas got released from prison. Although we see these circumstances arise, we know that it was God orchestrating all of this to ensure that his plan of salvation for the world would take place. Sometimes it can be difficult to read the gospel accounts without the pre-knowledge that we have. And so I was deliberately reading as if I was a disciple, as if I didn't know what was coming. Almost being a devil's advocate. So we can see the hand of God weaving in and out of these verses, but they wouldn't have been able to see that. Verses 12 to 14. What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews? Pilate asked them. Crucify him, they shouted. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. You might be able to tell from my interactions in this passage that I had a bit of a soft spot for Pilate. Did you notice that? I was sort of coming down on his side, and as the passage goes on and as time goes on, and eventually I recognized that Pilate, that soft spot, was not going to come about. We were going to see that actually Pilate was a people pleaser. He was between a rock and a hard place, and yet he's playing the role God had ordained for him from the very beginning, that he would do exactly as the prophets foretold. Mark continues, but they shouted all the louder, Crucify him! Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. So Mark finally makes up his mind about Pilate. I'm sure it was a disappointment to Mark back then. And as I said, I was rooting for Pilate too. And he let me down. And that's the problem with people pleasers. We're looking for them to say the right thing at the right time. And they will say the right thing at the right time because they're a people pleaser. And it makes me wonder, have I ever been a people pleaser? Am I even a people pleaser now? Is it possible to slip into that? How many of us want to satisfy someone else, deferring to another to keep the peace? It's a tough one. We know what Jesus says about lots of different things. But sometimes in the effort to please the people, we don't want to say some of those difficult things that Jesus says. The motive of the heart is the big deal in the Bible. Therefore, in some ways, it's no wonder that Mark draws our attention to Pilate's motives. What is my motive? How about you? What's your motive? Just going to pray. Father God, only you know our heart. Only you know our motive. When we say something, when we do something, would you help us to see what you see? Would you help us to change what we need to change? Whether it's in our thinking or whether it's in our heart. Thank you that you are looking at the heart, that you are looking to see the change in us, that you believe in us more than we believe in ourselves. Thank you for sending Jesus for us. Thank you that he rose again for us. Thank you that he took all our sin on him. Thank you. As we often do, if you ever, and if you want to, even right now, if you want to receive prayer for anything, it doesn't have to be about healing, it can be about anything. If you would like to receive prayer, just let one of us know and we'll come alongside you and pray with you.